my question is about the poetry of your prose. You said several times you consider yourself first and foremost as a poet. And to quote you, poetry is probably the most important part of your writing. You said it's the foundation, it's the source of everything else. And you also said that a great deal of The Famished Road was actually written in poetry metrically. So could you share with us that how you go about that, creating that rhythm, or perhaps whether the images come first and the words later, or the contrary? How the creation of the poetry within the prose.
Well, I think there are two kinds of writers. Maybe there are 20, but you can boil it down to two. And the one kind of writer is, for want of a better word, the organic writer, the one who the world that they're trying to create, and the book they're trying to write, has to have, as it were, a completely self-generating root, out of which everything emerges. So the integrity of the work comes really from the inward growth of the idea. And there's the other kind of writer, which is, for want of a better phrase again, an external, a composite. They put it together deliberately. They shape it externally, more like sculpture. And with The Famished Road, it was really it's an integral work in that sense. So what I'm trying to explain is that everything is contingent in the book. The minute I realized that the real core of the book is something impossible, which is the idea of this spirit child, and that the spirit child is primarily a poetic being. You have to understand that the core of it is poetry precisely because of the consciousness of the narrator. And he's a spirit child. And the spirit child is part here and part there, part in this world and part in the other, part in the world of the real and part in the world of the dream. The minute you accept that and as its basis, the poetry comes out of that. Because for me, in a way, poetry is, of course, rhythm and meter, but it's a dual state of language, that it's part here and part there. It's part dream and part reality, part intelligence and part instinct or intuition. Poetry is always part shadow. And that's the poetry that the book came out of, the fact that this character is constantly seeing the world with a dual consciousness. So that what appears not to be real to us is real to him, and what appears to be real to us is not real to him, and that's where the poetry comes out of. And therefore it was very slow and very difficult, because if you miss the beat 1 minute, if you go out of the beat, you're out of that world, and that's the source of it. Really, it's the consciousness of the narrator.
Yeah, and I really very often read your novel, The Famished Road, as poetic prose. And I could hear, as you said, the beat, the music, the voices. And today we've been discussing quite often the issue of genre. So, of course, genre is an arbitrary category. But I was wondering whether you sometimes think of your writing, if you think of your writing in terms of genre, which by that I mean that I read your essays as poems, I read your poems as essays, I read your novels as poems. You see, I don't feel, contrary to the work of the writers, where I can really feel the difference between a novel and an essay. When I read your work, I don't see any really boundaries between those genres. Is it something that you've experienced as well, or?
Well, I'm a kind of a blender and a blurrer, because, I mean, I've said fundamentally I'm a poet, but primarily a novelist, which is another way of expressing the fact that for me everything comes out of a rich, complex river. And why should an essay not partake of poetry, and why should poetry not partake of thought that we associate with the essay. The demarcation of boundaries is a very artificial thing. And I think works of art, I think every genre is enriched by its boundarylessness. And every genre for me is always mutating into something else. The novel itself has never been fixed. Its boundaries has never really been fixed. It's only recently we start to speak of one thing as being a novel and the other thing as not being a novel. But actually the novel has always been a rather dangerous river that overflows its boundary and invades the surrounding cities. That's the way it should be. It is a rich and fluid thing. Because we're talking, finally, always in the novel, however you want to define it, we are talking about a rich and fluid thing, which is human life in society. Having said that, it doesn't mean I don't pay great attention to the demarcations of each genre. It's just that, given the example of the essay, I'm fascinated by the way in which the source, the origin of the essay, had something very close to poetry in it, anyway. And I'm thinking of the essays of Plutarch, I'm thinking of the essays of Montaigne, of Bacon, some of my great favorites. They always were very compressed, especially the Baconian essays. It's so compressed that he was, in a sense, very close to poetry. So in a sense, your reading is intuitively right.
And I remember that you said at some point that a novel is a river to you. And
a novel is a river and a short story is a glass of water.
Is a glass of water, yes.
To come back to the question of voice, Henry James once fussed a lot when he wrote what Maisie knew about having the point of view of a child and wondering whether he should adopt the vocabulary and language of a child, and he decided not to because probably he would have hated to. So I was wondering if the fact that Azaro is a child obliged you to adapt the language in any way, or did that not come into account? Did you need to think that the language ought not to be too complex, or was that never a question?
It was a very important question. It's the child narrator, from the great child narrators of Huckleberry Finn to modern times, the early parts of David Copperfield. It always has been a tricky thing about the relationship between vocabulary and the voice. But in this particular instance, it is complicated by the nature of his consciousness, by the fact that he's a spirit child, and by the fact that this novel is retroactively told. The point of view of the telling and the teller is ambiguous. By that I mean, it's not being told in the time of the person that you're reading about. Yeah. That ambiguous distance already also complicates the vocabulary. The second thing is, some things are so difficult to convey simply. Certain states of mind, certain twilight conditions of perception. And I wrestled a great deal about the relationship between vocabulary and consciousness being expressed. And I came down to the conclusion that really, at the end of the day, it is what is being felt, it is what is being sensed that is the most important thing. And therefore, I shouldn't worry too much about the register of vocabulary by which I do that, so long as there is that profound transparency of the feeling and the perception coming through. Sometimes you can encounter a complex sentence in which a very simple and pure emotion comes through. And sometimes you can encounter a very simple sentence in which a very complex and profound emotion comes through. So the vocabulary is not really the primary means by which the emotion is expressed. It's sometimes the arrangement of words. I've only spoken about what I'm about to say once, and I'd like to express it now quite clearly. And it's that one of the ways in which the family short was written was I used a technique that I now call echo writing, which is that we tend to read words on a page like that, sequentially like that, we go down like that, but that's not actually how we read. Because when you're reading a line of prose like that, your eye also sees one word there and sees one word there and you see contingent words. And that was very much part of how the story was told, the way in which you read a sentence but you pick up a word just diagonally below. And that influences the way in which you actually read the sentence you're reading. So in a sense, it was written partly like painting. And that's why I frequently meet people who say, when I reread The Famished Road, certain things that I thought I saw on certain pages, when I went back there, they were not there. What's happened to them? And it's exactly that, the fact that we read contingently as well as sequentially, and I was playing with that a great deal in that text. So I suppose if the book is read out, you would lose a lot of that contingent reading.
That's very, very interesting, because I was indeed thinking about voice. We've just talked about the voice of the child, but there are many voices in the novel, sometimes indistinct, anonymous voices, and voices at the market, for example, or voices of spirits, or voices that are not even identified. Sometimes you hear the voice was not that of a spirit, but then we don't know whose voice that belongs to, disembodied voices. And so I was interested also in these voices, what I feel are sometimes choruses of voices that are commenting on the action. I remember
we're getting really serious here.
I remember a scene at the market when you hear voices which are commenting on Azaro, and yeah, that made me think of a Greek chorus. So can you tell us a bit more about the status of these voices?
Well, I can't really, because partly because I don't want to over-identify them, and partly because it's the way in which you know the famous line from The Tempest, where was it Ferdinand who said the island was full of voices. Well, actually, you know, when Gustav Jung came to Africa for the first time, that's what he said. When he stood on the soil and he said, "This place is history. All of its histories, all of its hidden histories, just rises up at you." And that's what Africa is like to anybody who is halfway sensitive. It is full of voices. It is full of presences. It is full of all kinds of things that are ambiguous in the sequence, or even, if you like, the hierarchies of beings. He hears them, nobody else does. And that's because he's a spirit child. So when you ask him for the exact identity of these voices, you're asking me to break the seal of a mystery which must remain that way, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and I wasn't really asking about the identity, because depending on the scenes, actually, the voices do not have the same status, I'd say. But I was more thinking of, you know, the opposition between, on the one hand, an individual voice that is identified, like that of Azaro or that of Dad, for example, which is very recognizable. And on the other hand, these voices, when even visually on the page, when we see these voices, I come back to my idea of poetry. I feel that it's, you know, visually it makes me think of poetry, and even the voices with all the sonorities and the echoes make me think of poetry. So I was thinking of voices that have a different status, I'd say.
Well, in the world or in the text?
In the text. In the text, yeah.
But it's dual, because it's also in the world. It's also in the world of what am I trying to express here? I'm trying to express the multifarious dimensions of textuality as well as of a reality. So there must be an equivalence between these two things. The multifariousness, the multidimensionalness of a reality must have its counterpart textually. So if you like, you think of it as a rich opera of presences, and that's really what I'm trying to orchestrate.